Right. Hi. Thanks for coming. This workshop is going to very briefly talk us through our branch's various procedures and how members can bring motions to the branch to get the branch to take action that they'd like. Generally speaking, I think I'd just like to start us off with just some quick introductions so all of us know who everyone is. Could you just start by saying what your name is and if you feel comfortable sharing your preferred gender pronouns, which school or department you're from, and just answer the question, what one action would you like the union to take? This could be the branch or the UCU more generally. We can talk more about those things as we progress with the workshop. For example, my name is Vivek Santayana. My pronouns are he, him. I'm in the School of Literatures, Languages, and Cultures, and I'm also UCU's branch treasurer. And I would like the union branch to adopt a formal constitution. The structure of the workshop itself is going to be like this. I'm just going to talk very briefly about what a motion is and what the structure and template of a motion looks like. I'll talk briefly about my experiences on how to make a motion persuasive. And then for about 20 minutes, we'll workshop our own motion. And then after that, I'll talk briefly about what the next steps are after you've written the motion itself. So just to start us off, I'm going to talk about what a motion is. Now, this is honestly fairly simple once you get behind the jargon. Now, a motion is the basic instrument through which our union's democracy works. The language of a motion draws from parliamentary procedure. And depending on which country you're from, you might be familiar with different versions of this. Robert's Rules is commonly used in the US, and Erskine-May is the one that's used in the UK and in many parts of the Commonwealth. There are some differences in terminology of specifics in these various procedures, and it can be quite alienating to have to navigate all of this. But hopefully this workshop will demystify the basics of a lot of this procedure in a way that is relevant to our branch's democracy without having to talk in elaborate or exhaustive or exhausting detail rather of all the more arcane rules of Robert's Rules or whatever have you. A motion, then, just unpacking all this jargon, is a formal procedure that is voted on, and when it is carried by a majority, it becomes binding on the branch or the union. Now, this can be any action that you want the branch to take or any policy you want the branch to adopt. Usually, it's a simple majority that passes a motion, but some motions that could amend the branch's constitution could require a two-thirds majority, and those will be dependent on the branch rules themselves. You don't need to worry about those details just yet, but as and when they become relevant, I'll tell you what information you need to look out for to determine this. And finally, motions are instruments that apply to all levels of the branch's democracy. These motions can go to the branch general meetings, but also to UCU Scotland or UCU UK at the relevant congresses of these bodies. UCU Scotland convenes a congress of all the Scottish branches, and likewise UCU UK convenes a congress that invites delegates from all branches across the UK. And at these congresses, various branches put forward motions as a branch rather than as individual members, and those motions need to be ratified by a general meeting of the branches themselves. This is to ensure that there are democratic procedures that allow memberships to vote on motions that they require the entirety of the UCU organization at the Scottish level or national level to take. And the important thing to remember about this is there is no hard and fast rule about how a motion is meant to be written or structured. What I'm going to talk about are some conventions that we follow, which are easy shorthands so that everyone can recognize and read the structure of a motion more clearly. There aren't any binding rules per se, but these are just useful structures that we have as a convenient shorthand. So what is this shorthand? What does it look like? Well, there is a simple version to this, and that skeleton is then elaborated on into a more formal structure. So the simple version is that the text of a motion should basically say what action you want the branch to take and why we should be doing it in the first place. Now, this has three parts. You need to establish the background and context for the motion. You need to give the beliefs and motivations that justify the action. And obviously, you need to give the action that needs to be taken, the last being the most important part of the text. Now, you can develop this structure into the formal template that we use in our branch. And the more sort of complicated formal version of this temp structure is this. The text of a motion is normally broken down into 3 or sometimes 4 sections, depending on the specifics of the motion itself. The first is the notes section, which are usually statements of fact that constitute the background and context of the issue. These could be things like statements of fact pertaining to relevant pieces of legislation, relevant issues that have happened recently, or rules or policies of the branch themselves. This is basically facts that outline what the problem is and what the context is for this action. The next section is the beliefs section, which basically establishes the principles or beliefs that motivate the action proposed. This is not necessarily statements of fact, but more valuative statements that justify the action that you're proposing. And then you might have noticed a pattern here. The next sections are the resolves and the mandates sections, and these are the sections that give what action you need the branch or union to take. Now, the resolve section is the more common one, where you outline what action you want the branch to take. This is actually why motions are sometimes called resolutions, because they're eponymous with this section. And mandates are specific kinds of resolutions where you mandate specific officers of the branch or union to take certain actions. They're less common because motions generally apply to the whole branch, but sometimes you might mandate specific officers to take certain actions. Those are the times when a mandates clause might be relevant. Now, within each of these sections, you arrange the statements for your motion into serialized and numbered clauses. And the reason being, it just makes it easier for us to reference and discuss them during the floor in case they're being debated. To say, for example, section 2 believes clause number 3 or whatever. And when you draft your motion, try to make every clause a simple declarative sentence. The shorter and more simple, the better. Try and break it down into subclauses and paragraphs if that makes it useful. Try and avoid ambiguous syntax because that can make it quite difficult for us to implement the motion or to know what the motion means in the flow of the discussion. Now, all of this can seem very abstract, so I'm just going to talk you through a very short example. This is an example of a motion that passed at our last extraordinary general meeting. This is a motion that I had proposed, and to be fair, the motion is much longer than this. This is just an excerpt from the motion calling on the branch to conduct the consultative ballot that we have going on now. So you'll notice that there is a notes section which establishes in the first clause the context of the dispute with management. The second clause, the issue around the increase in COVID cases and the more communicable variant of the virus emerging. And then the medical advice. The notes clause basically highlights the context in which the motion is operating. The believes clause establishes the principles that are motivating this. Now, like I said, these aren't statements of fact, but these are valuative statements. And finally, the resolves section gives you what the action is that the branch needs to be taking by passing this motion. So that is what a motion looks like. But obviously, there's more to a motion than just writing it. A motion needs to be persuasive. Now, these are just my experiences on what makes a motion persuasive. Obviously, it varies from issue to issue and the scale of the problem and whom it affects. But from my experience, there are just 3 things to bear in mind. The first is make sure that the context is clear and urgent. Use the notes section to establish what the problem is and why it is important. Now, the motion about the consultative ballot, it established that there was an ongoing dispute with management, and this dispute was in the face of medical advice issued by the Scottish government. Then outline the guiding motivations. Use the belief section to justify why this action will address the problem and why the branch ought to support it. Going back to the belief section, the consultative ballot motion, I used the belief section to basically establish the principles we wanted the branch to follow and we wanted to hold the university to. For example, the university should follow the spirit of the law and not just the letter of it. The university should cease trying to find loopholes in legislation. This establishes the justification for the motion itself. And there's a reason to this that I'll talk about later on when we talk about presenting the motion. But just to foreshadow it for now, use the text of the motion as an additional speaker on the floor. And I'll explain this more in more detail later when I talk about presenting the motion. And finally, specify a clear and achievable course of action. The more concrete the action, the more persuasive it is, and try and give as detailed of a time frame as possible while also making it realistic. And that is a tricky balance to achieve, but it's a balance that would need to be struck in order to make the course of action viable and achievable. So that's a broad outline of what a motion looks like. These procedures will become a lot more familiar the more practiced you become with them. So once you've written a motion, once you've seen what it's like, once you've seen things happen and become more familiar with the union, it'll become a lot easier to know what text you'd need to put in a motion. And also, once you propose a motion, there might be people making suggestions like this on the floor to add nuances or details to this that could be beneficial. I'll talk about that later on. But the structure of the motion, coming back to our earlier skeleton, is UCU Edinburgh notes something, believes something, and resolves something else. Is what comes next. Like I said, email it into Peter. Peter prefers the motions to be in early so we can send it to our branch membership at least 5 working days before a general meeting. And that's to make it more democratic, to allow people to speak at the meeting if they want to object to it. Ambushing people with a motion at the last minute isn't really particularly fair or democratic. So members of the branch committee will discuss the motion with you and talk you through how to present it. I'm more than happy to discuss this with you. And then you will need to prepare a speech in favor of the motion. Now, the standing orders of the branch say 5 minutes, but realistically, given how busy our meetings have been, it's usually 3 minutes in favor of the motion. And this will need to be a speech in favor of the motion. Don't just read the text out, but summarize the text and explain why people should support it. Remember what I said earlier about using the text of the motion as an additional speaker for. What I mean by that is, when you draft a motion, everyone will be given the text of the motion in advance of the meeting. If you write the motion in a way that the notes section highlights why the problem is urgent, the belief section gives a very persuasive justification for supporting the motion, and the resolve section gives a very cogent plan of action on what can solve the problem, then the text of the motion by itself will persuade people to vote in favor of it. Your speech then becomes additional supporting material that you can use to emphasize the key points of the text for people who might not have read it, summarize the most important principles or arguments, and give a broad justification for why people should support it. So just bear this in mind, the fact that people would have already read the motion or at least had the text in front of them. So you don't just need to read the motion out, but just try and invite people to vote in favor of it. And then you will need to present this at a general meeting. So there'll obviously be some procedures that we need to follow. And just to conclude, I'm going to give you a brief snapshot of the outline of what happens in a meeting so you know what to expect. But we need to usually cross this bridge when we get to it. So don't fret about this too much just now. We'll talk you through this once we got a draft of the motion ready. The first thing is the proposer speaks in favor of the motion. You as a proposer would need to speak for between 3 to 5 minutes on why people should support the motion. Now, either no one wants to speak against the motion, in which case it's seconded as a formality and then we vote on it straight away. Or if people want to speak against it, we go into a structured debate on the motion. Now, when there's a structured debate, the seconder of a motion, well, the rules for the debate will vary depending on which meeting it is. And we normally alternate between people speaking for and people speaking against. And the seconder of the motion is given the first opportunity after the proposer to speak in favor of the motion. So normally when you pick a seconder, get someone who is helping you write the motion and can speak to backing you up on why the branch should support it. Then each speaker may only speak once in the debate, except the proposer, who is given a right to reply. So you are the only speaker as the proposer who can come back and speak a second time to respond to all the criticisms or comments made by other people on the floor. And then people can recommend amendments on the floor. The way this works varies from meeting to meeting, and this can, the procedure can vary depending on the standing orders. Amendments are treated the same way as regular motions. They need to be moved and seconded and debated on the floor. Amendments are effectively like subsidiary motions. People move amendments to change the text of the existing motion and to say something like, I would like to add a clause to mandate this committee member to do this, or I would like to remove the clause that mandates the vice president because the vice president is too busy. Like, there can be specific amendments which then get debated, and then you as the motions proposer get to make a decision on this. There are some jargon that I'll explain about friendly amendments and wrecking amendments. You as a proposer can choose to accept an amendment as friendly, in which case you can just take the amendment to the motion and we vote on the entire motion and the amendment. This saves us time, and we treat it as if you had moved the original amended motion in the first place. Yeah, so either you accept an amendment as friendly, or this is entirely at your discretion, you insist that the amendment is voted on separately. Now, this is because if someone suggests an amendment which is a minor tweak that will make the motion which will make the motion clearer, it saves us time to just vote on the whole thing. But if you feel that an amendment would substantially change the spirit of the motion, you can choose to have it debated separately. The other thing is a wrecking amendment, and this is an informal piece of jargon. And there are no formal rules about this, but there's an unwritten rule that amendments can't necessarily change the spirit of a motion, because that undermines a motion itself and is a separate motion in its own right. So in some cases, the chair might exercise discretion on preventing certain amendments from being moved because they would completely undermine or substantially change the spirit of a motion. But that is very rare, and that varies from meeting to meeting. That's just something that might come up. So I wanted to introduce the term wrecking amendment to you so you're not caught off guard when it comes up. And then eventually there will be a vote on this. First, all amendments will be voted on, and then the motion will be voted on based on which amendments were passed and which ones rejected. Any motion that is voted on will be, any motion that is passed will become binding. Motions that are straightforward motions about branch actions will be um, binding on the branch. Any motion that requires substantial changes to the branch constitution or rules might require a 2/3 majority. So yeah, that's mostly it. That's it for the actual content of the workshop that I had to talk about.